Hi guys, it's Miss Hall with another video in our World Religion series. Today, rather than adding a new religion, we're going to talk about the role that religion played in the Middle Ages. As we learned in a previous video, Charles Martel stopped the Muslim invasion of much of Europe at the Battle of Tours, so there was little Muslim influence in Europe, which allowed for a very powerful Christian church to emerge. Religion was very important in the Middle Ages, and in reality, the medieval church was the most powerful force in Europe. The teachings and practices played a major part in shaping the lives of European Christians. As we've talked about previously, one of the most important achievements of the Church in the early Middle Ages was to Christianize the diverse people of Western Europe. In this lesson, we'll learn about the impact that this Christian influence had on the Middle Ages, including how the Church and its monks and nuns shaped medieval life, how the power of the Church grew, how the reformers worked to change the Church, and the problems that the Jewish communities faced. Let's start by talking a little bit about the role the church played in medieval life. The priest of the parish or region was usually the only contact that people had with the church. The priest cared for the souls of his parishioners by celebrating the Mass and administering the sacraments. Sacraments are the sacred rites of the church, and they included things like marriage, baptism, and a good Christian burial, which was important in getting to heaven. Christians believed that faith in Christ and participation in these sacraments would lead them to an everlasting life with God. Priests also preached the gospel and guided people on issues of values and morality. These Christian rituals and Christian faith were a part of everyday life for most people during the Middle Ages. The village church was more than just a religious place, it was also a social center. After services, people would gossip and dance, even though sometimes the priests were not happy with their bawdy songs. But the villagers took pride in their church and they decorated them with care. Some churches housed relics, which are the remains of martyrs or other holy figures, to which people would make pilgrimages to pray. To support itself and its parishes, the church required Christians to pay a tithe, which is a tax equal to 1/10 of their income. Daily life revolved around the Christian calendar, which marked holy days such as Easter and many others honoring the saints, in addition to the different seasons. The church's views on women are interesting. They taught that men and women were equal before God, but on earth, the idea was that women were descendants from Eve, the first woman who sinned, and they were viewed as weak and more easily led into sin, and thus they needed the guidance of men. At the same time, however, the church did praise the ideal woman who was modest and pure, like the Virgin Mary, who was the mother of Jesus, and men and women asked Mary to pray to God on their behalf. But the church did do some things to try to protect women. They set a minimum age for marriage and they fined men who seriously injured their wives. But the reality was that often the church punished women more harshly for the same crimes as men. I'm sure you've heard about men called monks and women called nuns, and this sort of started during the Middle Ages. Monks and nuns were men and women who decided to withdraw from the world and pursue their spiritual goals. About 530, a monk named Benedict organized a monastery of Monte Cassino in southern Italy and created a set of rules to govern this monastic life. His rules were used in monasteries and convents, which is where nuns lived, across Europe. Under the Benedictine rule, nuns and monks took 3 vows. The first was obedience to the abbot or abbess who headed the monastery or convent. The second was to poverty or living poor, living like the poor. And the third was to chastity or purity. Each day in the life of a monk or nun was divided into a period of worship, a period of work, and a period of study. It was believed that hard work was important to God and that by working at difficult tasks, you got closer to God. In a world that didn't have hospitals or schools, monasteries and convents often provided those basic services. Monks and nuns gave food and lodging to travelers, especially those coming to see the relics. They looked after the poor and the sick, and they sometimes set up school. They also performed the vital role in preserving the writings of the ancient world. They often copied ancient works as a form of labor, which helped keep learning of those ancient works alive. In Italy, Abbot Cassiodorus wrote useful summaries of the Greek and Latin works and taught the classics to the monks. In Britain, the Venerable Bede wrote the earliest known history of England. And so through this writing as a form of labor, these monks and nuns helped protect and preserve these early histories. As I've said before, a convent was sort of like a monastery for nuns, and although women could not become priests, many of them did enter the convents. Their capable, strong-minded women could escape some of the typical limits placed on them by society. In the 1100s, Abbess Hildegard of Bingen composed religious music and wrote books on many subjects. Popes and rulers sought her advice, and she was able to speak her mind freely, which is something that a peasant woman would not have been able to do. Of course, later, the church did end up putting more restrictions on nuns and withdrew some of the rights that the nuns had once had, and they began to really frown upon women having too much learning. Now, in the medieval church, it was not just a spiritual force. It also gradually became a powerful secular or worldly force. It was a representative. The Pope was seen as a representative for Christ on earth, and these medieval popes eventually claimed what was known as papal supremacy, meaning they had the authority to rule over all religious and secular rulers. High clergy, such as bishops and archbishops, were usually nobles, and many had their own territories. The Pope himself had vast lands in central Italy. Because churchmen were often the only educated people, feudal rulers appointed them to very high government positions. So the mingling of politics and the church was very powerful during the Middle Ages. The medieval church developed its own laws known as canon law, which applied to the religious teachings, the clergy, marriages, and morals. And anyone who broke these laws faced a range of penalties, including excommunication. If excommunicated, a person could not receive the sacraments or a Christian burial, which basically was the same as condemning them and keeping them out of heaven. It was a very strict punishment. If a powerful noble opposed the church, he could actually face the interdict, which excluded an entire town or region or kingdom from receiving the sacraments. Through this, the church tried to use its authority to end warfare, and they declared times of truce or temporary peace, known as the peace of God. The church demanded that there was no fighting between Friday and Sunday each week and on religious holidays. And it's possible that this effort on the behalf of the church may have contributed to the decline of feudal warfare. The very success of the church led to its wealth and power growing, which of course led to corruption. Some of the clergy lived in luxury and even treated the priesthood as a family inheritance, using the tithes of their parishioners to fill their own wallets. And throughout the Middle Ages, voices called for reform. In the early 900s, Bernard of Cluny, a monastery in France, set out to end these abuses by reviving the Benedictine rule. He declared that he would not let nobles interfere in monastery affairs, and he filled his monastery with men devoted to the religious pursuits. In time, many monasteries and convents copied the Cluniac reforms, and in 1073, Pope Gregory II extended them to the entire church. He outlawed marriage for priests and prohibited simony, which is the selling of church offices, and he insisted that the church and not kings or nobles choose church officials. In the early 1200s, Francis of Assisi and Dominic took a new approach. They set up orders of friars, or monks who did not live in the isolated monasteries but traveled around Europe preaching to the poor. The Franciscan order preached poverty, humility, and love of God. The chief goal of the Dominican order was to combat heresy by preaching the official Roman Catholic beliefs. Women also joined in this movement by creating new religious groups. One, called the Beguines, welcomed all women and sold their weaving and embroidery to help the poor and set up hospitals and shelters. Now, we've talked a lot about the role that the Christian church played in medieval life. What about the Jewish faith? In reality, there were Jewish communities across Europe, and in their homes, the Jewish people preserved their oral and written laws of their faith. The Jews flourished in Spain, where the Muslim conquerors were very tolerant of both the Jews and the Christians, and Spain actually became a center of Jewish culture and scholarship. During the Middle Ages, Jewish farmers migrated to other parts of Western Europe and lived side by side very peacefully with the Christians for centuries. In the late 1000s, things began to change a little, and Christian persecution of the Jews increased. Many church leaders charged that the Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, and that as the church grew in power, it began to pass laws that forbid Jews from owning land and practicing most occupations. In really bad times, anti-Semitism, or prejudice against the Jews, worsened. Facing disaster and disease that they didn't understand, the people blamed the Jews, and facing a lot of persecution, thousands of Jews began to migrate into Eastern Europe, where they were welcomed and thrived and were able to be more successful all the way until modern times. So, in conclusion, the church did have a very, very important role in the life of people in the Middle Ages, but as the church grew in power, it also became more corrupt. There, of course, were several different calls for reform amongst the nuns and monks, and during all of this, the Jews existed peacefully in Europe until the persecution from the powerful Christians began to force them to move east. All right, be sure to review this video and your notes and be ready for a quiz.